So today is week 9 of 12. So we've got 3 more classes after today. So I've gotten most people's submissions for assignment 3. I should have those marked sometime this week, certainly before Friday. They don't take very long to mark. So I thought about starting them this morning, but didn't figure. I had a few student meetings. I figured I didn't have enough time to do all of them, so I kind of wanted to sit down and tackle the class batch of assignments when I could sort of do them all at once rather than doing it piecemeal. So those should be done. I'm thinking, looking at my week, maybe Thursday afternoon. I've got a window of time that might be a good time, but should have them done before the weekend. You'll have your marks back for assignment 3. And if you haven't submitted, please make sure you do so. A late penalty will apply, but obviously getting some marks is certainly better than getting nothing. So what are we doing today? We're doing a lot, okay? We want to complete our shopping cart. We want to integrate authentication into it so users can shop anonymously, but we're going to force them to log in or first register in order for them to check out. And then we want to focus on implementing Stripe. So Stripe is a common payment gateway service. They've got an API, so we're going to integrate this, it's so that it's a seamless experience for our users, where we can invoke calls to Stripe, process credit card transactions, and then Stripe will send us back a response whether the payment on their side was successful or unsuccessful. And if it's successful, we want to generate a new order, save all the items in the user's cart to that order, and then generate an order confirmation. So we do have quite a bit of stuff we want to do today. My goal is to kind of have this full cart, including the payment process, have this all done before we get out of here today. Okay, so without further ado, let's open up our last chapter project. We'll get it running, and we'll get to work on this. For now, I'm going to close everything except my shop controller. We're going to have to do more work in the shop controller. So I'm going to leave that file open. I'll start up my server. And let's see where we get. I'm just going to go right to the cart page. We'll put a link to it in the nav bar, actually. So you go to shop cart, and right now I get this. So we probably also would want to do a little check on here that A, will want to put a link in the nav bar, and B, will want it so that this page doesn't show the table headings, it shows a message instead if the cart is actually empty. So let's start by adding a little cart link to our nav bar. If we've got time later, we might also add a little badge with a number that'll show how many items are in the cart, but we'll see if we've got time to implement that. We may or we may not. So I'll open up my, oops, not that view. I want the layout view under views and shared. So I'm just going to copy. Here's the link we've got that goes to our shop controller and calls the index method. I'm just going to copy this link, and then I'm going to change the action and the text on the link to say cart instead. So copy that link, that list item. I'm going to change the action on my duplicate link, cart. And we can just make our link say cart. So now we have a way, right? As we left our site last week, the only way to get to the cart was actually to go to the URL directly or to add something to the cart. But you couldn't navigate around the site and get back there. So this link that we've added here, on lines 28 to 30, this should allow us to get to our cart from anywhere. Now I can browse around, shop, but at any point I can go and see what's in my cart. So we also want to add a little condition here to the shop cart view. Before we just go ahead and start displaying this table, we should check if there are actually any items in the shopping cart. So let's go and open up. I'll leave the layout file open because we may use it again. We may make changes. Like I said, later on, if we can add a little badge here with the number of cart items, we will. So I'll leave it open in case we want to do that. So under shop and cart, I've got this whole table here, which I'm just going to close up for a minute. So I want to wrap this whole table in an if statement. So before we get the table, we'll do at if, oops, sorry. So if our model has a count method. So if the number of items in the model is greater than 0, that means, there's at least one item in the shopping cart. So I'm going to move this whole table, so all of the rest of the HTML we've got on the page, I'm going to move it in here. So I'll just cut it, paste it. So now we only get the table if there is at least one item in the cart. We can then display a simple else down at the bottom, where we might say something like, your cart is empty, and give them a link to start shopping. So I'll go down to the bottom, add a simple else. So your cart empty. You need some books. And then we'll just put on a button or a link that goes to the main shop page where they can pick a category and then start that whole process. We can set the ASP controller, but we don't really need to because we're already in the shop controller and we're linking to the index method in the same controller. So in that case, the ASP controller is optional. So now we won't see those table headings if the cart's empty. We'll see this message instead. Format my code nicely. And so all the HTML we already had, it's now wrapped in this if statement. If our model.count is greater than 0. And count, it's not a property, it's a method. So you need those brackets because there is a count property as well. If I take the brackets out, yeah, then it does this. So make sure you've got those 2 empty brackets so that it's a method call. So now I get this, right? So now I can shop, put something in my cart, and now we get the cart being visible. So to complete this page, we want to calculate a running total. So down at the bottom, we want to add a kind of a footer row to the table where we want to calculate the total value of the cart and display it down here. And then we'll want 2 options over here. We're going to have a keep shopping button that will just take the user back here. We'll also have a checkout button that will then start the checkout process. So inside our loop, we're going to initialize a variable, a total variable, to 0. And then as we display the items in the cart, we'll need to do the math to calculate and keep a running total that we can display down at the bottom. So I will declare up here a variable I'll use 0.0 so it knows to read it as a double. Oops, sorry. If I just declare it a 0, it's going to infer that it's an integer. Okay, so we'll declare it before our table. And then inside our loop, we can increment it. So it'll be the item dot price times the quantity. So we'll figure out the subtotal for the current book based on how many you want and what it costs, and we'll add it to the running total. Nothing fancy here, nothing too complicated. You've used plus equals many times before, simple math formula. And then we're going to scroll down to the bottom. And after our loop ends, so after this closing curly brace, but before our table body ends, we're now going to put in one more row. So we've got book name, book image in the second column, book author. The price is the fourth column. So we want to display the price over here. Let's see. We'll put in a first TD will be call span of 3. This will just be empty. And then in this fourth column, we can output the price. And we'll do it in currency format, just like we did up above on line 55. So we're going to output our total variable here in currency format. And then we'll add our buttons in one column that span over the last 2 columns of the table. So our first button will say keep shopping. And it'll just go back to the shop index page. So it'll take them back to the list of categories. They can buy another book, find another book. The second link, just copy, is going to go to a new action that we'll create next called checkout. And our button will also say checkout. And so this entire row here is new code. This will happen at the bottom of our table. We'll have to try it out in the browser and see if any adjustments are necessary. So I need to go put a couple items in my cart. Okay, so it shows me the total, and I get my 2 buttons here at full scale. This is how it looks. I also want to check the math, so I should add another item and maybe choose a quantity of more than 1 as well. So I'll keep shopping. I'll get 2 copies of this one. Okay, so my math seems to be correct here. And then again, I can continue, or I could check out, which will give me this. This is to be expected because checkout doesn't exist yet. That'll be our next step, is building that checkout method and form. And it's at this point that we are going to force somebody to log in. So they can get to here, but as soon as they click checkout, we need to know who they are. Here's the HTML again. Anybody lost any questions so far? So checkout is going to have both a get and a post method. We want to display a form for the customer to enter basically their address and contact info. So the get method's going to be really simple. We're just going to return a view. We can use scaffolding to build the checkout form. We'll have to make a few adjustments to it. And then we'll have to write the post method, which will then take the user off. The next page will continue to the payment page. And then from there, we're going to invoke Stripe. So let's go to our controller. Let's generate the checkout method in the shop controller. So this will be a get method at shop/checkout. No parameters. Really simple method. It just returns a view. The only other thing we are going to add here is we are now going to add the authorize annotation. At this point, we want users to log in. And in order to use the authorize annotation, we'll need to make a reference, like we did in our other controllers. We'll need to reference the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authorization library. Same way we did in our books and categories controllers. So I'll just accept that reference. Just a simple method that returns a view of the same name. We can use the scaffolding tools to build this view for us. We don't have to do it from scratch. So I'm going to right-click my method, add a view. We're going to pick a razor view because we want a checkout, we want a form being built. I'll click add. Our view name is checkout. Our template is create because we want a blank form. The model we're going to use is the order model, because the order model has information about that we want to capture about the order. So things like the customer's name, address, and phone number. So here are the options we need to scaffold our view. The name is checkout, the template's create, the model is order, everything else is kind of standard. Usual DB context, script file, script files, layout page. Okay, so pick those options, click add. So here's our checkout form. Pretty good. Obviously, there'll be a few adjustments we've got to make. Let's try it out. Now, at this point, I will recommend, because we're requiring authentication here, it's going to be easier to just log in and stay logged in. Otherwise, we're going to have to log in and out every time, which becomes tedious. So I'm going to start shopping. Put a couple items in my cart. And when I click checkout, it's going to force me to log in. Okay. Now, I could use either the customer account we created or a Google login. Either one doesn't really matter. Maybe I'll pick my customer account for now. So my view is not found. I think I need to build, I didn't build the solution after creating the view. So make sure that you build your solution first. I'll have to go and redo that. Oh, and then it gives me this. So here's my form. Okay. So what changes do we need to make to our form? I could see at least probably 4 or 5 things that we need to modify here. Okay, agreed, Megan. The customer ID, we're just going to pull from the email address. The purchase date, we also want a hard code. Agreed. So we will hide those 2 fields. Yep. Anything else? What else would you need to change? Yeah, the payment code. That's right, Austin. Customer's not going to enter that. Correct. And we should probably add some display attributes to the first name, last name, and postal code in the order model. So these labels have spaces on them. Yeah, and the create button and also the back to list. Thanks, Hannah. I think also the order of this, we can get rid of this. So let's clean up the stuff in the view, and then we'll make the changes in the model as well. So let's go to our checkout page. I'm going to get rid of the H4 tag here on line 9 that says order. Don't need it. We can get rid of the divs starting on line 14. For customer ID and purchase date, we're going to set these things programmatically. Our customers are not going to type these things in. So just delete them. So that way our first form group will actually be first name. As Austin said, we'll also get rid of the payment code input group. So this is the last set of labels and inputs on the form. Get rid of that. Hannah said the button shouldn't say create. It should say checkout. Yep. I'm getting rid of this back to list. This makes no sense here. Again, this is the scaffolding. Assuming that back will take them back to a list of orders, we're not going to have this here. So let's get rid of that as well. So I've taken out the order tag, the order H4, taken out the customer ID and order date. We've taken out the payment code. We've taken out the link that says back to list, and we've changed our button to say checkout. So now it looks like this. Looks better. I'm going to go to the order model and assign display names to the 3 properties that are multiple words. So that way we can inject the space before the second word. The other thing I might actually do as a useful instruction here, I'm going to put an H4 back, actually. I'm going to say all fields are required. So our users know they're going to have to put everything in. We don't have to do that, but I think it's helpful. So I'm going to go and open up the order model. So I'll add a display attribute for first name, last name, and postal code. And by putting it in the model, that way these changes will apply globally. Later on, we're going to scaffold an orders controller so we can generate like an order history and order details pages. That way, these properties will show in a more user-friendly format on those pages as well, right? Because this model will cascade to any of the views that use it. So just go ahead and create that display name. Now I think our form is pretty good. Art. Check out, and I arrive here. So now we'll need to write the post method. What happens here? We've got to capture all this data before we get to the checkout. So now we're going to write our post method. So this method uses HTTP post, and it's going to be authorized as well. So you've got to be logged in order to actually call the method. So now we've got to bind the form inputs, which will be first name, last name, address, city, province, postal code, and phone. We're going to bind those to an order object. So we haven't really written this code before because we've used it, but the scaffolder generated it. Sorry, I missed the keyword here that should be bind. And I'm missing, what am I missing syntactically? Sorry, my syntax is bad. Bind, and then another set of round brackets with a quote. Sorry. Okay. I have to shrink that down a bit so you can see it. So we've got square brackets and then the bind attribute, round brackets, and quotes. So this automatically will map each form input to the order property with the same name. Now we need to fill customer ID and order date properties. So we can set our customer ID this way. with our user.identity.name. That'll give us the email address. So we'll set our purchase date equal to datetime.now. Whoops, sorry, it's not a method call, it's a property. So now what we want to do, which is going to be a bit of a trick, we now have this order object. We don't want to save it to the database yet, however. How come? So we have an order, it's complete. We've got all these fields from the form. We filled these two programmatically, but then what are we going to do with this order object? Why is it too early to save to the database? What's our next step in the process going to be? Okay, Megan, you're getting warmer. What else has to happen before we could save this order to the database? Okay, Xavier, we will want to show them a confirmation, yes, but that'll happen actually after. We'll save to the database first, and then we'll show the confirmation. So there's something got to happen in between. There's a missing step here in this process. Thank you, Austin. Right, they've got to pay. So we don't want to save the order to the database until they've paid successfully. Okay, so we're going to need a payment page. We're going to need to take the user off to another page. But the problem is we don't want this order to go in the database. We need some way of saving it, though. Where could we save the order while the user goes and pays? And then if the payment is successful, then we'll save it to the database after. So we need some kind of way, because we're going to leave the checkout page here. So how can we save this kind of temporarily? Where can we put this order? We could, Megan, we could put it in the view bag, but again, the view bag is not strongly typed. And we also have a few more pages we need to go through. So that would be an option. Where else could you save something if you need it to persist for multiple HTTP requests? That's what I'm thinking, Chris, right. We could, now that we've populated this order object, we could store it in a session variable so that after the payment is done, we can then read it out of the session and save it to the database. And then, as Xavier said, show the confirmation. So we want to save order session var. We can retrieve, save to DB after successful payment. So let's look. If we go to our HTTP context, session, the problem is, by default, the .NET Core session object only supports strings and integers for session variables by default. It doesn't have a method that actually will save a complex object like an order. So we're going to need a little help in doing this because the functionality we need, it doesn't ship with .NET Core. So I've given it, there's a link here on D2L in the week 9 folder, a link to a little open source library. The second item here is store complex objects in a .NET Core session. So it says that it only has 3 methods to set, which are set, setInt, and setString. Set accepts a byte array, and integer and setInt and setString, they obviously, those are self-explanatory. But what do we need to do if we want to store a complex object? That's what we want, right? We have an order object that we've defined in our model with a whole bunch of properties. So this developer has come up with a little library, a little extension they called session extensions, and in there there's 2 methods. They've got setObject and getObject. So how do these work? Well, if you call setObject, it converts your object, it serializes it to JSON. So it will create a JSON object, a JSON file in memory, and then it calls setString. So it actually stores a string representation of our object in JSON format. If we then want to read the session variable we call getObject, we cast it as the type we want, and then it deserializes, it converts that JSON string back into our native type. So we're going to use this library, and that way it will do the work of serializing our order object to JSON, and then when we need to read it back out, it will deserialize it from JSON back into our native object. So what I'm going to do, so there's the raw code from the GitHub repo. So we're going to make a class called session extensions, a static class, and then we're going to include these methods. So I'm just going to copy that entire class definition from the raw code. I'll go back to Visual Studio. I'm going to right-click my project, and we will add a class. I will call the class Session Extensions. And as usual, I'm going to use Pascal case. So this will be a global class where we can then invoke those 2 methods, that setObject and getObject. So in here, we get a class definition. I'm just going to delete it and paste in the code from the library. Now, there's a few things missing, a few references. It needs a reference to ASP.NET Core.HTTP to access the iSession interface. It also needs a JSON parser. And the default JSON parser that Microsoft uses was not actually created by Microsoft. It was created by a developer with the last name of Newton. His company is Newtonsoft. So he's written a very popular JSON parser for use with .NET. So we're going to add those references into our class. I will also just put a link into the file So we're using this third-party code. I will give credit to the developer. Also, that way, if we have an issue with it, we know, we're working with this library, and down the road, suddenly we have an issue with it, we know where, we found it today, but we might forget where this code comes from. So it's a good idea to include that link so we can always go back and refer to the documentation if we need it. So now we should be able to call the setObject method. That way we can pass in our order object and store it in a session variable this way. So I'm going to go back to my controller. And now we have the setObject method. So we've extended the iSession interface. So we're going to set an object, and it takes just two parameters. The name, so what do we want to call the session variable, and then the object we are passing. So we'll just call it order, and then we'll pass in our order object. So we will use the session extensions library. So I'm just putting a note in here so that we know why we've called setObject and that we're using this class we've created from the tutorial in order to do this. And then lastly, we will just return a redirect. We're going to take the user off to the payment page, which we'll build next. So later on, we will want to call getObject when we're ready to save to the database after we pay, after our customer pays. We're then going to need to read this session variable back so that we can actually create a new order along with all the order detail lines in our database. So we can create this method in Vue. We'll do that quickly, and then I think we'll take a break. And when we come back, we'll look at including our Stripe configuration for payment. Our next method will be shop/payment. Again, it's going to require authentication. This one's also a simple method here. We'll need to add a little bit more code, but for now, we'll just say return a view. So it's really identical to the checkout method. We will need to put a bit of code in here for starting to configure the payment gateway, but we'll do that in the next part of class. And now we can just generate an empty view called payment. So I'll add an empty view. And it just gives me this, just fine. Guess we could set the page title if we wanted. And maybe here we just have an H1 that says payment. So we'll try it to here. I'll try my checkout, my whole checkout process again and see that we at least land on the payment page. I know the page is blank. Most of the code that's going to go here, we're actually going to get from the Stripe documentation. So I will try this again now. Go back to my cart. Maybe I'll put another item in there. So I got 2 items in the cart. I check out. So I'll try my checkout. And now it takes me to the payment page, which is where we want to be at this point. So I think we're well set up to, in the next hour of class, to get into working with Stripe and integrating the payment gateway. So I'm going to push my changes up. One. So I've uploaded everything we've done so far. Let's take a break here. And when we come back at 2 o'clock, we'll do a quick review of the Stripe documentation and how it works and their integration guide. And then we'll take code from their integration. We're going to have to make some adjustments. So I'm going to work exactly how we want it to, but it will give us most of what we need. We'll make some adjustments, and then we should be able to actually call the Stripe API and send payment requests. Once that's done, then we can save the order to the database, we can clear out the user shopping cart, and we can display an order confirmation page. So let's take a break here. The code has been uploaded to GitHub if you need to reference anything, and we'll come back at 2 o'clock.